Let's talk about that last concern that I brought off. What if they insist, hey, I'm giving you a lot of money on this. I want the deed to it now and you can sell or finance it. I don't just want like a flimsy lease with an option to buy. I don't know if you're going to lien up the property, all those kinds of things, even though we're prevented from doing that, right? Now, here's my 2 cents on this. Generally, now with the exception of Texas, we're just going to owner finance everything in Texas. I know you can do lease options in Texas. I just prefer to owner finance in Texas. I don't like giving up ownership of a house that I'm selling, even on terms, until my buyer is ready to cash me out. So, and that's just for my own ease of fixing a situation if it breaks. Doesn't have to do with me like trying to pull a fast one on anybody. So I always make the point to the buyer that we're going to protect your interest in literally every way possible. But you got to understand, I don't want to be in a potential foreclosure position if something goes wrong with you, right? I don't want to have to be in that position. I don't have to go down that road. So the only way I'd be willing to give up the deed before being paid in full. You understand what I mean when I say give up the deed? Seller financing means you give up the deed and they owe you the money on whatever terms you set up. A lease option means you're renting it to them, but you're given the right to buy the property and cash everything out and get the deed sometime later. That's a huge distinction that people for some reason seem to be confused on. Like a lot of people in this seem to be confused on it. It starts making me wonder if I'm not explaining it well enough. When I give you the deed, that's because I've seller financed it to you, meaning you're buying the house, you're getting the deed to the house, and in return I'm accepting some kind of a payment stream to come in, either to me or the bank if it's like a subject to type deal, whatever. But I've given you ownership, I've given you the deed. Now if I'm concerned about doing that because the only way I can get it back is if you don't pay on that debt you have to me, meaning I'd have to foreclose, then I'm going to say, well, I will lease it to you, so I'll give you monthly payment terms on this. You'll have full control over the property. You just won't own it because I'm not going to give you the deed until I get paid off in full. That's a lease option. Now, will I bend on that? Yes, but it takes a lot to get me to bend. So I'll say, look, if that's what's preventing you from moving forward, I can do it your way, but this 5%, 8%, 10% that I'm taking as an option fee, a non-refundable option deposit or as a down payment on your option, that has to go way up. So, I seller finance, you're going to come with about 60%, and then I'll finance the rest. Then I'm not worried that you're going to walk away. So if you insulate my risk, then I'm good. So in other words, they have to have a really high down payment in order for me to be willing to do that. Now, a lot of y'all aren't going to follow that guidance because you're going to see the fast money. This is the problem that I have with some of these Facebook groups where people who are frankly novices to all this are getting properties tied up in the way that I'm teaching and the way that others are teaching. They get the property tied up and then they sell it to somebody who has no concern for the original seller. They owner finance it to somebody, like maybe they get the property at 5% down and then they owner finance it out to somebody with 10% down. They make a 5% spread, then they're making monthly money, the difference between what their buyer is paying them and what they're paying the seller. They're still in the middle, but now all of a sudden their buyer waffles and stops paying, and then they didn't leave enough cushion in there for themselves. They got a foreclosure or immense. They go through all those costs. That buyer files bankruptcy. Now you can't even get them out of the house for a long time. Meanwhile, they still owe payments to the seller that they promised to make payments to. This is why I have such a problem with the way creative finance is being taught by others in such a cavalier way. And what I'm afraid is going to happen is the same thing that happened with wholesaling. So you're going to have a lot of people coming and doing this like you see now, right? There's a lot of people that are more familiar with these processes, but they aren't actually deeply educated on it, and they're listening to a bunch of hype that they heard on Instagram and social media, and people who wear baseball hats with the peace sign on it. Like, why do you want to wear somebody else's hat? I don't know. It's kind of weird. I don't want you all walking around with Terms Daddy hats on. I don't know. It's such a cult. But the point is, it's being taught in a very aggressive and careless way. I've already seen instances, heard of instances where people want me to try to bail out the situation. I'll get on the phone with them, and the situation is that the seller is getting hurt. They were promised one thing. They were told a bunch of stuff from somebody who watched Instagram or something like that. And then the next thing you know, they're hurt. Their credit is destroyed. They're not going to get the money that they were expecting to get. And the whole thing is just a giant mess. So what recourse do they have? Well, there's consumer protections, right? If the proper paperwork wasn't put together, which it probably, I don't know if it is or isn't, but they go to some kind of, whoever the regulatory authority is in the area, or worse, go to legislators. And if the legislators start hearing enough of this, that's how you get wholesaling law after wholesaling law after wholesaling law after wholesaling law. This was not a problem a few years ago. Today, it's a very big problem because people are getting hurt by the cavalier attitudes that are out here. I don't have a cavalier attitude to this. I'm going to protect my seller if I owe them money by not just giving the deed willy-nilly to somebody to create a spread that looks good on paper. because we're dealing with human beings, and human beings mostly suck. That's why I like dogs. Like I said in the bottom, I want to protect my seller as a matter of good faith. That's why I really seldom will assign seller finance deals, even though that's all the rage, or sell it in any other way than just cashing out. Using a lease option so that I retain the deed, I retain the ability, and I've got the protection for myself because I got a big enough down payment to deal with the problem if I have one. Eviction is a lot easier than foreclosure almost everywhere. I don't want to be in a foreclosure position unless I have enough down, and for me, at least half. Forget that 20% stuff, right? We could see volatility where the market declines 20% and then you're sitting at over 100% loan to value. That's trouble, okay? I want 50% if I'm gonna do that. Now, if I'm in Texas, I'm not worried as much because the foreclosure process is much more streamlined than elsewhere. You know, it's about the same as it takes to evict somebody in most other places. So I can get the deed back quickly. So we just owner finance in Texas. But other places, it's not like that. Texas just, Texas could be its own country. It's run differently, okay? So, and when it comes to people's financial commitments, if you don't pay, you cannot stay. And they make it easier on the people who extended that financing than places like Illinois and California. And, just remember now, if you acquired the property on a lease purchase, do you have the deed? No. You have a rental agreement and the ability to buy it later. So if you acquired it on a lease and you don't own it yet, even though you have the option, you can't sell it with owner financing because you don't have a deed to give somebody. You can only cash out of it or sublease it with an option to someone simultaneously closing on those options later or not, right? You both don't close on your option potentially. Okay, so it's either cash or a sandwich lease, or we end up renegotiating, with the seller. Like if someone needs owner financing, they're willing to put like 50% down, or maybe not. Maybe it is 20% down. You could go to the seller and you could try to renegotiate a deal, explain the whole situation. You buy it on owner financing and then sell it with seller financing to accommodate your buyer. That could be done. But generally speaking, without any of the renegotiation stuff, if you have a lease purchase, you can't then sell that same house on owner financing unless you renegotiate. Okay, so in other words, you can't be the financer of a house that you only hold a lease on and an option on. It's almost always easier to evict than it is to foreclose if your buyer does end up with a problem. Life happens, right? If your buyer does end up having a problem paying. So that's why transferring the ownership can usually be avoided simply by making the buyer feel comfortable with the lease and the option deal. Their rights are pretty much the same. They can, we'll let them do things that make sense with the house, as far as improvements and those kinds of things. But until they own it, they're gonna have to check with me on certain things. But if they lease it, they're working towards owning it. They have a right to buy it. I have a contractual obligation to sell it for that option price. I can't go against that, otherwise I'll get sued and lose. I'll lose badly. So they're in a very good position. And the fact that I'm not gonna do stupid stuff like lien the property or have judgments attached to it and things like that. Other people, you don't know who that's going to happen with. That's why I don't like to be in the position of lease optioning generally. I don't like to acquire on a lease option, so it's like we have a different set of standards when we're the buyer than when we're the seller because of who we are and what our metal is and what we're made of and how we're trained and what we understand and what our skill sets are. I wouldn't let a 15-year-old kid drive me down the highway in a car most of the time, right? But I might let that 15-year-old kid take me on bicycle, like, stand up on those bars on the back or something. I might let him transport me somewhere that way. Stakes are less, depending on the skill level. Terrible metaphor, but anyway, you get the point. All right, now, if it's gonna be a very long-term deal with your buyer, then it might be okay to transfer ownership after they've reached a certain level of down payment and finance the rest. So like that loan qualification assistance program that I've given you, if you have some kind of a deal where every 6 months they're throwing in another $5,000, another $10,000, something like that. Sometimes we structure the deals that way. Once they get to a certain point, I'll let them have the deed to the property because I'm still very well protected, and we'll just give them a note mortgage for the rest. But not until they get up there, and my loan to value is very low. I don't like to owner finance properties. If any of these rules have been violated, I certainly don't like to owner finance properties where there's personally guaranteed debt. Some of y'all have come to me, worried about the market, worried about interest rates, thinking you got an interest rate of like 2.75 or 3 and you want to owner finance it at 6 or 7 to make it easy on somebody, and you'll make a nice little spread on that. But you got to remember, you've personally guaranteed that debt on the underlying loan. You don't want to be doing that when you're giving someone else the house and your loan hasn't even been paid off yet, in my opinion. Now our sellers can feel comfortable doing that because of, again, our skill sets. We know we're going to get them to the finish line, but I don't know that from other people, like from the buyers, right? The buyers are going to be of a much lesser skill set than we are. I expect people to owner finance properties to me, even if they personally guaranteed the debt, because I know there's not going to be a problem. I'm going to pay their debt, and it's not going to be a problem, even if my buyer doesn't pay me. That's the way you should intend to act. And if you don't have the money, so you're scared to do that, then you get the money by getting a big enough down payment that you're protected, and you don't go buying a car with it right away, or buying whatever with it, or paying your bills off with it right away. You hold it so that it's in an account to protect the position of that seller should something go wrong with your buyer until you get cashed out. That's the smart way of doing it if you want to be sure that you're going to be able to uphold your word and your contractual obligation. If everybody was doing creative finance that way, I'd be fine, but not everybody is doing that. Very clearly, they're not doing that. And the people who are teaching it must know this, which is what bothers me. So don't own or finance properties where you personally have guaranteed debt. Now, you should never personally guarantee debt once you've been trained through this, but a lot of you have a personal house, or even though technically on paper I could be wrong in terms of the way it looks right now, right? Because maybe the value of the property went way up, so it was worthwhile for you to do it. But just understand you took a very big risk. You got paid off, but it could also go the other way. I've been around long enough to see how these cycles play out. I don't know if we're going to go through another one of those cycles or not. Don't have a crystal ball. But I do know that I can get as much property as I want without having to personally guarantee debt, so I do it that way. Also, that's another thing. You transfer that deed on owner finance, you personally guaranteed the loan. Remember, the lender can call it due. Then what? Not saying it's going to happen, but it could. You want to just take that risk as someone who's trained like we are? So that's why the number one strategy for us to sell is either to cash out because we have plenty of equity in it already, we've milked it enough, or to use a lease with an option strategy so that it can marinate for a while in terms of you getting cash now, cash flow, longer term wealth, and you retain as much control as possible because you still hold the deed to the property.